The message came while I was still on the floor. My phone buzzed against the tiles close enough that I could see the screen but too far to reach without pain. I remember staring at it, not surprised by the name, only by the words. Stay away. That was all. No question about my condition. No acknowledgement of what had just happened. No concern for the blood, the swelling, the fact that I could barely stand. I had already realized something was wrong long before that moment. The silences. The way stories shifted. The way people looked at me as if I were inconvenient. But that message confirmed it. Someone had decided the truth was a problem, and it was easier to remove me than face it. Before everything broke, my life was quiet in a way I took pride in. I worked regular hours, came home on time, and kept my routines simple. I was not the kind of person who drew attention or demanded space. I believed that if you stayed consistent, reliable, and calm, things would generally stay in place. Stability felt like something you earned by not asking for too much. My brother had always been at the center of that stability. He was older, more confident, the one people naturally listened to. Growing up, I learned early that he spoke and I adjusted, not because he forced me to, but because it felt easier. He had a way of framing things as reasonable, inevitable. I trusted his judgment without questioning it. When he made decisions, I assumed he had already considered what I could not see. When he introduced his fiancée, I accepted her the same way. She arrived already certain of her place, already comfortable in rooms that still felt borrowed to me. She spoke clearly, decisively, and never hesitated in conversation. People responded to that. I told myself that confidence often looks sharp at first, that it softens with familiarity. In the beginning, she was polite, not warm but correct. She asked the right questions, laughed at the right moments, remembered names. I noticed she watched people closely, especially when they spoke about themselves. At the time, I interpreted that as interest. I did not yet understand how attention can be used. Family gatherings continued as they always had. Meals were planned around my brother's schedule. Decisions were discussed, then settled quickly once he weighed in. I stayed on the edges of conversations, listening more than speaking. That had always been my role, and it had never felt like a burden. Silence gave me room to observe, and observation felt safe. There was an unspoken rule in our family: problems were handled quietly. Discomfort was something you worked around, not something you announced. I followed that rule instinctively. When something felt off, I assumed it was my responsibility to adjust. I had done that my whole life. I remember thinking more than once that my brother seemed happy. That mattered to me more than my own unease. He spoke about the future with certainty, weddings, plans, changes that felt permanent. I listened and nodded. I believed that if he was moving forward, then we all were. She began spending more time around us, more time in shared spaces. Her presence changed the atmosphere slightly, though I could not have explained how. Conversations seemed to end sooner. Small jokes landed differently. I noticed myself choosing my words more carefully without knowing why. I told myself this was normal, that new dynamics always take time to settle. I never imagined myself as someone capable of being a problem. I did my best to be agreeable, helpful, invisible when necessary. Trust came easily to me because I assumed it was mutual. I believed that family loyalty was instinctive, that it did not need to be tested to be real. Looking back, I understand how much I relied on that belief. It allowed me to ignore small signals, to dismiss tension as imagination. It kept me quiet when speaking might have clarified things earlier. At the time, it felt like maturity. My life then was built on assumptions that had never failed me before. That love was protective. That silence was neutral. That trust, once earned, did not need to be defended. I did not know yet how fragile those ideas were. The first moments of discomfort were small enough to ignore. They arrived without drama, without a clear beginning. A tone held a second too long. a look that lingered after a sentence ended, nothing I could point to without sounding unreasonable. I noticed them, then told myself noticing did not mean anything. She corrected me once during dinner. It was minor, almost helpful, and everyone moved past it immediately. I felt a brief heat in my face, then embarrassment for feeling it at all. I told myself I was being sensitive, that confidence can sometimes sound like authority, that it was my responsibility to adapt. My brother did not notice, or if he did not react. He continued speaking as if nothing had happened, as if the balance of the room was unchanged. I watched him closely after that, searching for signs that I was not alone in what I felt. I found none. There were other moments. She would speak over me, gently but firmly, finishing my thoughts before I had. Sometimes she smiled while doing it as if it were a kindness. People laughed, the conversation moved on. I stayed quiet, my contribution erased before it had fully formed. I began to feel out of place in rooms I had been part of my whole life. It was subtle but persistent. I hesitated before speaking. I replayed my words in my head before saying them, then decided not to. Silence, which had once felt safe, now felt imposed. Once she commented on how I organized my things. The remark was framed as curiosity, but it landed like assessment. I felt examined, measured. When I tried to explain myself, she nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already believed. That unsettled me more than the comment itself. I mentioned none of this to my brother. I could not find the language for it. How do you explain discomfort that has no clear shape? How do you describe a feeling without evidence? I did not want to seem difficult. I did not want to create friction where everyone else seemed comfortable. Instead, I adjusted. I stayed out of shared spaces longer. I answered briefly when spoken to. I watched more than I participated. I told myself this was temporary, that familiarity would smooth things out, that once the wedding stress passed, things would return to normal. But the feeling followed me. It showed up in my chest when I heard her voice, in the way my shoulders tightened when she entered a room. These were reactions I could not control, and that made me distrust myself. I wondered if something in me was changing, if I was becoming overly cautious for no reason. There were moments when she was perfectly pleasant. She asked about my work. She thanked me when I helped. These moments confused me. They made it harder to hold on to my unease. They suggested that the problem, if there was one, might be mine. I began to keep quiet records in my head, not accusations, just observations. I noticed patterns in how she spoke to others versus how she spoke to me. I noticed how easily she redirected conversations away from topics that did not interest her. None of it was overt. That was the problem. At night I replayed interactions, wondering if I had imagined the tension. I reminded myself that trust should not require constant evaluation. That family does not operate on suspicion. I wanted to believe that. Still, something had shifted. The ease I once felt was gone, replaced by a careful awareness I could not turn off. I did not yet see it as a warning. I saw it as discomfort to be managed. I did not know then that this was the beginning of something that would no longer allow me to stay quiet. The first clear red flag did not arrive as an explosion. It arrived as a contradiction. She told a story one evening about something that had happened earlier that week. It was casual, meant to fill silence. I listened without interrupting until she mentioned a detail that could not be true. Not dramatic, just wrong. The place, the time, I knew because I had been there. I corrected her gently. I did not accuse, I did not raise my voice. I framed it as confusion, not challenge. She paused just briefly, then smiled and said I must be remembering it wrong. The room moved on. No one questioned it, but I did not forget the pause. After that, I started noticing more inconsistencies. Small shifts in stories depending on who was listening. Details adjusted, motivations rewritten. Nothing big enough to call a lie outright, but enough to feel deliberate. Once she claimed I had agreed to something I knew I had not. When I said so, she laughed lightly and said I must have forgotten. My brother backed her without hesitation. He said she was probably right. That hurt more than the claim itself. I began to feel unreliable in my own life. Conversations left me doubting what I had said, what I had promised, what I had meant. I started checking messages after interactions, searching for proof of my own memory. This was new. I had never needed evidence to trust myself before. She spoke about me to others when I was present, but as if I were not. Not insults, assessments. She described my habits, my personality, my supposed limitations. Each comment was framed as concern. Each one positioned her above me, explaining me. I tried to laugh it off. I told myself this was her way of fitting in, but laughter does not erase discomfort, it only hides it. There was a moment I remember clearly. We were alone in the kitchen. She asked me why I was so quiet around her. The question sounded neutral, but the way she asked it was not. It carried judgment, expectation. I told her I was just reserved. She tilted her head slightly and said that could be misunderstood as passive-aggressive. Her words landed carefully, like something practiced. I felt accused without being accused. I realized then that these interactions were not accidental. They followed a pattern. She framed herself as reasonable, observant, helpful, and me as difficult, forgetful, emotionally unclear. The imbalance was quiet but precise. I considered speaking to my brother. I rehearsed the conversation in my head. Each version ended the same way, with me sounding dramatic, with him defending her. With nothing changing. Still, I tried once. I mentioned that some things she said made me uncomfortable. I did not give examples, I was careful. He listened for a moment, then said I was reading too much into it. He said she was just direct. He said I needed to be more flexible. That conversation closed a door I had hoped would stay open. After that, I stopped sharing how I felt. I learned that speaking only gave others material to dismiss. Silence again became my shield. But it no longer felt like choice. It felt enforced. The red flags became harder to ignore. The way she corrected me publicly but never privately. The way she spoke with certainty about my intentions. The way my brother deferred to her even when she was wrong. I felt watched, evaluated, as if any reaction I had would be added to a private list she was keeping. I also noticed how calm she remained when I was unsettled, how steady her tone was when mine faltered. That contrast made me appear unstable even to myself. I started writing things down, dates, phrases not to use against her, just to ground myself, to remind myself that what I experienced was real. This was when suspicion became something I could no longer dismiss, not yet a conclusion but a recognition. Something was wrong, and it was not going to resolve itself. Once I began to recognize the pattern, the pressure increased, not outwardly, not in ways that could be named easily, but in how every concern I raised was turned back on me. When I spoke, I was told I was sensitive. When I stayed quiet, I was described as distant. There was no position I could take that did not become a flaw. The contradiction exhausted me more than the interactions themselves. She began responding to my discomfort with calm explanations that sounded reasonable to anyone listening. She never raised her voice. She never insulted me directly. Instead, she framed my reactions as misunderstandings, as emotional projections. Her language was careful, clinical almost. My brother repeated her words later, often without realizing it. He told me I seemed tense lately, that I was interpreting things through a negative lens. That stress can distort perception. I recognized the phrases. I had heard them before. I tried to explain myself more clearly. I chose my words slowly. I avoided emotion. I gave examples this time. Each one was met with a counter-explanation. Each concern was reduced to intent. She did not mean it that way. She was trying to help. She was being honest. Honesty, I learned, can be used as a shield. When I insisted that intent did not erase impact, the room shifted. She became quiet, hurt. My brother turned toward her immediately. He asked why I was attacking her. The accusation stunned me. I had not raised my voice. I had not accused her of anything. Still, I apologized. Not because I believed I was wrong, but because I wanted the tension to end. That apology changed something. It taught them where the balance of power sat. After that, I was careful. I measured my tone. I softened my words. I apologized preemptively. And still it was not enough. She began to recount conversations differently than they had occurred, not dramatically, just enough to shift responsibility. I noticed that my words were often summarized in ways that made me sound unreasonable. When I objected, I was told I was fixating on details. Details, I was told, were not the point. The emotional labor of defending my own memory became constant. I questioned myself before others did. I wondered if I was, in fact, becoming difficult. The doubt crept in slowly, settling into places I did not know were vulnerable. There were moments when I withdrew entirely. I sat quietly, said nothing, watched interactions happen around me. Even then, I was not left alone. She commented on my silence. She asked if I was upset. The question was never private. It was always in front of others. If I said no, I was distant. If I said yes, I was dramatic. The framing never changed. My brother stopped asking how I felt. He started telling me how I felt. He said I was carrying resentment, that I needed to let go, that holding on to negativity was unhealthy. He said this with concern, as if diagnosing me. I realized then that my role in the family narrative had shifted. I was no longer a participant. I was a problem to be managed. There was a particular moment that stayed with me. She smiled and said calmly that maybe I was threatened by strong personalities. The room was silent. No one contradicted her. The implication hung in the air unchallenged. I felt small in that silence, not because of what she said, but because of what no one did. I began to isolate myself, not out of anger, but out of fatigue. I was tired of explaining, tired of being reasonable to people who had already decided what I was. At night I lay awake replaying conversations, wondering how I had lost so much ground without noticing. I could trace it now, the subtle corrections, the gentle dismissals, the way authority had shifted quietly from familiarity to control. This was not conflict, it was erosion. And I was starting to understand that it was intentional. The truth did not arrive all at once. It surfaced in fragments, uneven and unsettling, like pieces of a picture I had not wanted to see. It started with something small, a message sent to me by mistake, then quickly deleted. I had seen enough of it before it disappeared to know it was not meant for me. The tone was sharp, dismissive. It did not sound like the woman who spoke so carefully in front of others. I told myself it could have been taken out of context. Still, I could not forget it. After that, I noticed how conversations changed when I entered a room. Not silence exactly, more like a recalibration, words chosen more carefully, expressions tightening for just a moment before smoothing out again. I began to understand that there were versions of me being discussed when I was not present. I did not confront anyone. I observed. One afternoon I overheard part of a conversation I was not meant to hear. My name came up, followed by a pause, then her voice low and controlled. She said I was unpredictable, that I had a tendency to create tension. The words were measured, almost professional. They sounded rehearsed. My brother agreed, not enthusiastically, but enough. I stood still where I was, my body rigid, my mind strangely calm. There was relief in hearing it said aloud. It meant the discomfort had not been imagined. It also meant I was already positioned against something I could not easily undo. Later, someone else mentioned something to me casually, a comment she had made about my behavior. It was framed as concern, but it was inaccurate, not exaggerated, rewritten. I asked when she had said it. The person hesitated, then gave an answer that did not align with reality. That was when I realized this was no longer private. The narrative had spread. I began to notice how she gathered allies without appearing to. She asked questions that guided conclusions. She shared observations that sounded neutral but were not. People trusted her because she seemed calm, reasonable, composed. I, by contrast, had already been labeled reactive. I checked my messages. I reviewed old conversations. I looked for proof, not to accuse but to steady myself. Each confirmation felt both grounding and heavy. I was not mistaken, but knowing that did not bring comfort. There was a moment when I tried again with my brother. I asked him directly if he believed I was unstable. The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, then said he thought I was struggling. He said she was worried about me. He said they both wanted what was best. I asked him when concern had turned into discussion. He avoided the question. The imbalance was no longer subtle. Decisions were made without me. Boundaries were assumed rather than discussed. I was informed of plans instead of included in them. Each shift was small enough to justify on its own. Together they formed a pattern I could not ignore. Someone else saw it too, not openly, not fully, but enough to say something in passing. They told me to be careful. They did not elaborate. They did not want to be involved. That warning stayed with me more than any confirmation could have. I began to understand that the situation was moving beyond words. That the way I was being framed had consequences. It affected how others treated me, how seriously my reactions were taken, how much protection I could expect if something went wrong. That realization frightened me. I stopped engaging altogether. I limited interactions. I kept my responses neutral. I avoided situations where I might be misrepresented. This withdrawal was noted immediately. It was described as further evidence of my instability. The trap was complete. Every step I took to protect myself was used to justify the story already in place. Silence became secrecy. Distance became hostility. Self-control became coldness. At night I lay awake thinking about how quickly things had shifted, how little it had taken, how easily calm authority could outweigh lived experience. The truth was no longer hidden. It was visible but distorted, and I was beginning to understand that exposure did not always lead to resolution. Sometimes it only accelerates what is coming. Once the narrative was set, it began to move on its own. I no longer needed to say or do anything for it to advance. Others carried it forward for me. She became more confident, not louder, not harsher, more certain. Her words settled into rooms easily as if they belonged there. When she spoke about me, it was always with concern, always with restraint. She never accused, she suggested. She framed situations in ways that required interpretation, then waited for others to arrive at the conclusion she wanted. People did. My brother stopped checking in altogether. He stopped asking for clarification. He stopped giving me the benefit of the doubt. When something went wrong, his first instinct was no longer to ask what had happened, but to assume I had reacted poorly. I felt the shift most clearly when systems became involved. Small ones at first, plans that excluded me. Decisions made without consultation. I was informed after the fact, always politely, always firmly. When I questioned it, I was told it was for everyone's comfort. Comfort had become a justification that overrode fairness. She began documenting things not openly, casually. Notes taken during conversations, messages saved, screenshots referenced. When I noticed, she smiled and said it was just her way of staying organized. No one questioned it. It looked responsible. It looked reasonable. I, on the other hand, had already been framed as emotional. Anything I recorded would have looked defensive. The imbalance deepened. There were moments when I could feel her watching me, not with hostility but with assessment, as if she were waiting for something, a reaction, a mistake, proof. I became hyper-aware of my body, my tone, my expressions. I monitored myself constantly, trying to leave no opening. That level of control is not sustainable. It drains you quietly without spectacle. I made one mistake, a small one. I corrected her in front of someone else. It was factual. It was calm. It lasted seconds. The reaction was immediate. Later, my brother told me she felt attacked. He said I had embarrassed her. He said I needed to be more mindful of how my words affected people. I asked him why accuracy was now considered aggression. He did not answer. That was when I understood the stakes had changed. This was no longer about discomfort or misunderstanding. This was about positioning, about who was credible, about who would be believed if something more serious happened. I began to fear escalation not because I planned it, but because I could see how easily it could be justified. The groundwork was already laid. I had been described as unstable, reactive, difficult. All it would take was one incident framed the right way. That fear stayed with me. She started setting boundaries for me without my consent, telling others what I was comfortable with, speaking on my behalf. When I objected, she said she was protecting everyone, including me. Protection, I realized, can look a lot like control when it is imposed. I tried to regain some ground by being even more neutral. I limited contact to necessities. I avoided shared spaces. This only reinforced the image already in place. Distance was interpreted as hostility, restraint as resentment. There was no winning move. The pressure began to affect my body. I slept poorly, I ate less, my concentration slipped. These changes were noticed, then noted. I heard later that they were discussed as signs of decline. That knowledge made everything heavier. I started to understand that escalation does not always come with raised voices or dramatic events. Sometimes it comes through paperwork, through conversations you are not in, through decisions that quietly narrow your options. I felt cornered without being touched. The most unsettling part was how calm everyone remained. There was no chaos, no confrontation, just a steady tightening of circumstances, a sense that something was being prepared. I did not yet know what form it would take. I only knew that I was no longer safe assuming goodwill. The situation had moved beyond personal conflict. It had become structural, and I was standing alone inside it. The breaking point did not come with shouting or confrontation. It came quietly, in a moment when I realized I had already lost something I could not get back. I was sitting alone, replaying a recent conversation in my head when it became clear that I was no longer trying to understand what was happening. I was trying to survive it. That distinction mattered. It meant I had crossed from confusion into acceptance. I stopped asking myself whether I was overreacting. The question had exhausted itself. It no longer served a purpose. What mattered now was not how things should have been, but how they were. I accepted that my brother no longer trusted my version of events. That realization was heavier than any accusation. Trust, once gone, does not announce its departure. It simply stops showing up when you need it. I noticed how careful I had become, how every interaction felt like a test I could fail without knowing the rules. I weighed my words, my expressions, my timing. I measured silence against speech. There was no choice that did not carry risk. That constant vigilance wore me down. There was a moment when I caught myself rehearsing explanations for things that had not happened yet, imagining how I would defend myself if I were misunderstood again. That was when I understood how deeply this had affected me. I was preparing for harm as if it were inevitable. I felt grief, but it was not dramatic. It was dull, persistent. A mourning for a relationship that still existed in name but not in substance. My brother was present but unreachable. The person I trusted had been replaced by someone who saw me through someone else's lens. I also felt shame, not because I had done something wrong, but because I had been reduced. I had allowed myself to be positioned without resisting earlier. I had believed goodwill would protect me. That belief now felt naive. I stopped trying to explain myself to anyone. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. I could see now that explanations only fed the system working against me. Silence this time was not surrender, it was containment. There were moments when I wanted to confront her directly, to name what she had done, to force acknowledgement, but I knew how that would end. Calm denial, concerned looks. Another example added to the record of my instability. Understanding that did not make it easier, it made it lonelier. The emotional cost began to show in unexpected ways. I startled easily. I avoided mirrors. I felt disconnected from my own voice as if it belonged to someone else. I had to remind myself of who I was before all of this began. I remembered a version of myself who trusted family without calculation, who spoke without rehearsal, who did not fear being misunderstood. That version felt distant now, like a memory from another life. The hardest realization was this: even if the truth came out, it would not restore what had been taken. Exposure does not rewind time. It does not erase doubt. It only changes the shape of the aftermath. That understanding marked the true breaking point. I let go of the hope that things would return to normal. I let go of the need to be seen as reasonable. I focused instead on preserving what little stability I had left. I began preparing for consequences I could not yet see. Not aggressively. Quietly I documented, I stayed consistent, I avoided escalation. These were not acts of revenge, they were acts of self-preservation. There was sadness in that shift, but also a strange calm. When you stop expecting fairness, disappointment loses its power. What remains is clarity. And clarity, I learned, is heavy. The consequences did not arrive as a confrontation. They arrived as silence changing shape. I noticed it first in how people hesitated. Conversations paused when I entered, not because of tension, but because something had shifted. The certainty that once surrounded her version of events had softened, not collapsed, just weakened. It began with a small inconsistency she could not explain away, a record that did not match her account, a message timestamp that contradicted a claim she had made confidently more than once. No one accused her. They simply noticed. I did not point it out. I did not need to. Once doubt exists, it does its own work. My brother asked me a question one evening. It was cautious, almost neutral. He wanted clarification on something she had told him earlier. The fact that he asked at all mattered more than the question itself. I answered plainly. I did not defend myself. I did not explain my feelings. I stated what had happened and nothing more. He listened without interrupting. That silence was unfamiliar. After that, distance appeared between them. Not dramatic distance, practical distance. Fewer shared decisions, more private conversations. I was not part of those conversations, but I felt their effect. She became more careful, less confident. Her calm remained, but it no longer carried the same authority. When she spoke, people listened, but they also checked. That change was subtle but irreversible. There were quiet acknowledgements. A look held a second longer. A question asked instead of assumed. No one apologized. No one admitted fault. Accountability did not come in words, it came in adjustment. My brother did not suddenly defend me. He did not confess error. Instead, he stopped correcting me. He stopped reframing my words. He allowed my statements to stand without interpretation. That was the closest he came to recognition. I understood then that consequences are not always about punishment. Sometimes they are about loss of control. She lost the ability to shape every narrative unchecked. She lost the ease with which her interpretations were accepted. She noticed this. I could see it in how tightly she held her composure. The relationship between them changed. It was not my doing. It was the natural result of cracks she could not smooth over fast enough. Trust, once strained, does not repair itself quietly. I was no longer treated as a problem to be managed. I was treated as a variable that required consideration. That shift did not restore what had been damaged, but it did stop further erosion. There was no moment of satisfaction in this, no relief, just a dull recognition that the situation had reached its limit. I also understood that my brother would never fully admit what had happened. That kind of admission would require him to face his own choices. Instead, he adjusted behavior and called it resolution. I accepted that. The consequences were incomplete but real. They existed in the absence of certain assumptions, in the way power redistributed itself quietly, in the fact that I no longer felt watched. She avoided me after that, not out of fear, out of awareness. The dynamic had changed and we both knew it. Nothing was repaired, nothing was celebrated. The system corrected itself just enough to prevent further damage. That was all it was capable of, and that was all I expected. The ending did not feel like an ending. It felt like a settling. Life continued without announcement. Routines resumed. Conversations found new shapes. What had happened was not discussed, but it was no longer denied. It lived in pauses, in changed habits, in what was no longer assumed. I did not regain what I lost. The relationship with my brother remained altered, polite, careful, functional. We spoke, but we did not return to trust. There were things we both avoided now. That avoidance became its own kind of boundary. She was still present but distant. Not hostile, not apologetic, simply aware. We shared spaces without interacting. That silence felt deliberate on both sides. It did not need explanation. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. Waiting keeps you tied to the moment that hurt you. Letting go does not mean forgiving. It means refusing to carry what no longer belongs to you. I learned to trust myself again slowly. Not because others validated me, but because I no longer needed them to. I stopped replaying conversations. I stopped collecting proof. I stopped preparing defenses for situations that had already passed. The cost remained. It showed up in how cautious I became, in how long it took me to speak freely again, in the quiet grief of knowing that family does not always protect you. But there was also clarity. I understood now how easily authority can be manufactured, how calm language can outweigh truth, how silence can be mistaken for weakness. These were lessons I did not want, but they stayed with me. Nothing dramatic marked the end. No apology, no confrontation, no moment of justice, just distance where closeness once lived. And in that distance I found something stable, not peace exactly, but steadiness. A sense that I could move forward without explaining myself. The truth had surfaced enough to change the direction of things. That was all it was ever going to do, and that was enough to let me walk away from it quietly.